Okay, so this is going to be a video for my International Relations Comprehensive, for the study prep for that. I'm going to be discussing whether the democratic peace theory, DPT, is viable or not. In my view, it is not viable as a theory, and my main reason for that is that democratic DPT theorists, DPTists, make they make large empirical claims, um, but they don't have firm empirical. How to put this? They make large empirical claims without sufficient empirical discipline. So, the works I'm going to use for this are going to be Michael Doyle, who's one of the big. Michael Doyle talking about Immanuel Kant, so kind of the origins of the theory. Kant, the legacies in public affairs. Second, I'm going to reference on the pro side Robert Keeney. 20 years of institutional liberalism. Then Daniel Dewdney and Daniel Dewdney and John Eikenberry, which is going to be the nature and sources of the international order. Good. And then against, there's going to be, I'm going to use Christopher Lane. Kant or Kant, which is clever, and he has big contributions to threats. And then also discussing threats. And then there's going to be Kenneth Waltz, of all people. Of course, structural realism after the Cold War. Post-Cold War. And the structure of what I'm going to talk about is going to be one, what is the first bit of structure? Yeah, define it. Two, the problems. And then three, my conclusion. And maybe I'll tie in a bit of realist prudence with that. Pretty neat. Prudence, which brings me back to Morgenthau, so that's another source I can even talk about. And then besides Morgenthau, who else for spice? Charles Krauthammer, that crazy fucking guy. I probably shouldn't say fuck during my comps. Krauthammer, the unipolar moment. That guy's crazy. Okay, so let's talk about democratic peace theory. What is democratic peace theory? So for that, we should go to Michael Doyle, who talks about Kant, liberal legacy in public affairs, where he talks about Kant's perpetual peace. So with Doyle talks about the relation of kind of classic liberal domestic politics impact international politics because ideas matter, normative stuff matters. But essentially, he identifies three bits of Kant's perpetual peace, which still apply today. First is republics. So Kant thinks if you can have perpetual peace, you have to start with republics. Republics, in Kant's eyes, and in fact, in Rousseau's eyes, is similar to Rousseau in that they viewed the idea of the republic far differently than we would. So in Kant's eyes, a republic was basically any kind of liberal democracy. So it isn't, he has pretty strict bounds of actually what he means by liberal democracy, but I think Canada would probably count, even though it's not a republic, if you know what I mean. Second thing would be the Pacific Union. So Kant saw the Pacific Union as an institution, actually in a very modern way. Like a lot of modern theorists see institutions not so much as like the UN as an institution, you know, with a flag and whatever. An institution is just kind of like a set of norms that everyone respects. So, like we talk about, I don't know, like, oh, I hate to bring this up, but when people talk about the state of the institution of marriage, it's that kind of thing. Third is cosmopolitan law. So in Kant's view, cosmopolitan law is just the right to visit anywhere. Sort of like Schengen. A bit like Schengen, although Schengen's probably more than what Kant had in mind. In Kant's view, if everyone saw how everyone else lived, you know, if they'd be less likely to go to war. And Kant's probably talking about, you know, not talking about peasants and farmers. I mean, we're talking about people, right? And that's actually something that Doyle brings up. So one of the problems with democratic peace that Doyle highlights is that one of the foundational idea of democracy coming between morally autonomous people rests on seeing other people as morally autonomous. So if you're looking at like a imperial power, say, I don't know, the Netherlands in Indonesia, or the British in Africa, or we'll just say Europe and Africa. You can say, like, okay, we're going to have peace among ourselves because we're liberal democracies and we don't want to fight against other people who have moral autonomy. But people in Africa don't have moral autonomy. Like, look how underdeveloped they are, even though Bantu civilizations were actually pretty well developed. So, you know, knowing not to build next to the Malaria marshes, the Europeans didn't quite get it. Anyway, that's a problem, right? And it requires some kind of expansion of Kant's original idea. Still, Doyle points out that it's been mostly successful. You know, they don't really... In fact, J. David Singer, I can't remember the name of his article, but J. David Singer talks about this as well. There's empirical evidence that democracies don't go to war with each other very often, you know, that whole Correlates of War project. And if they do, well, that's an outlier, and we can, whatever. Classic quantitative scholars. Yeah, we have certainty until we don't. But listen to us. Second, Robert Keeney? Anyway, whatever. 20 Years of Institutional Liberalism. That's the name of his paper. And he's looking back kind of on... In the 2000s, he's writing this, saying, look at what we've done since the Cold War, right? Like, we've institutionalized a lot of kind of liberal ideas and stuff like the European Court of Human Rights and the International Criminal Court, and you know, suddenly sovereignty is a bit not quite as firm as we thought it would be, because now individuals can be prosecuted, and it's a bit of a deterrent, and we've moved past you know, kind of temporary alliances, and we're starting to work amongst ourselves. So that's one example. And look how successful it's been. Look how successful the EU is, although recently. Anyway, on the whole, I hate using this word, but this is a bit of a Whiggish, you know, view of history. It's all gravy. Actually, how's that look on camera? Yeah, there we go. Whig view of history. In fact, Daniel Dewdney and John Eikenberry talk a bit about this in The Nature and Sources of the International Order. They have an idea called structural liberalism, right? So it's kind of a counterpart to structural realism, right? Where anarchy makes forces, you know, Waltzian logic, enough anarchy, and eventually it'll force the creation of like units that all act, you know, to either, if you're defensive realists, to maximize security, or if you're an offensive realist, to maximize power. Dewdney and Eikenberry, anyway, they talk about this idea of structural liberalism, that certain ideas have become so, they actually goes beyond embedded, the terms they use, but basically liberal principles are so far and away they've become a fact of life and it can actually govern the actions between states, these kind of intersubjective reality. So, for example, one concept he uses the idea of semi-sovereign great powers. So, take a look at Germany, right? Germany, it's a great power that doesn't act, it's an economic great power, that's for certain. That doesn't political great power that doesn't actually act like a great power like Germany used to act. And that's partially because we have things like NATO, which are actually NATO and the EU, which have become facts that govern interstate relations in Europe. They've become permanent institutions. It's kind of created it's kind of like an intersubjective reality that's governing relations between Germany and its neighbors, much in the same way that Kenneth Waltz might argue that anarchy governs those relations, right? That Kenneth Waltz's objective kind of materialist view on anarchy is kind of now applied with a liberal lens. So yeah, the permanence of institutions like the EU and NATO and semi-sovereign great powers like Germany and Japan, for example, are good examples. And we haven't really had many wars in Europe, have we? And they're all liberal democracies. It's actually a pretty strong, it's a fairly strong empirical argument. Now, we get to the critics, and I think the critics are correct, right? So the first critic I'm going to talk about is Christopher Lane. So Christopher Lane talks in Kant, which is a great little, I find it amusing. It's a dad joke. It's a dad joke as a journal article. So Christopher Lane brings up the idea that, and in fact, Kenneth Waltz agrees with this too, the idea of a liberal democracy, when you want to go to war with the liberal democracy, you just find them not liberal or democratic enough, and then you go to war, and then we can claim we didn't fight other democracies, and liberal democracy is great, or democratic peace is great. Let's talk about threats. And Christopher Lane talks about threats. So one threat that he brings up is the Venezuela border dispute in 1895 between the UK and the US. Basically, the US enforcing the Monroe Doctrine. The British had to back down. Now, those two liberal democracies didn't go to war, but, I don't know. The U.S. fleet, the vulnerability of Canada, different parts of the British Empire to the Americans certainly helped force a hand. Same with the Ruhr crisis, right? Weimar Germany and France, there was the use of force and there were threats. It wasn't full of war, but again, if you're a good quantitative IR scholar, what you'll do when your data doesn't fit what you want is you just change the parameters of your data and you declare it different. And wham, suddenly you have this quantitative model that all those 88 historians couldn't possibly have done because there's not enough of they're not big enough Excel spreadsheet. Garbage. It's garbage theory. The second is Kenneth Waltz. Kenneth Waltz brings that up as well. In fact, Kenneth Waltz gets, naturally pessimistic because he's Kenneth Waltz. It's like, yeah, he brings up South America. Democracies don't go to war with each other until they look a little too commie, and then wham, your democracy's not stable enough. We need to intervene to put in a dictator. What this makes me think of is actually, it's very interesting, as our alliances in the Middle East. Without commenting on the strategic or political logic or validity of them, I'm not commenting on contemporary politics, merely saying that if the democratic peace theory was a strong theory, we should be friendlier with a semi-democratic kind of Islamic Republic of Iran and a bit more hostile to the absolute monarchy that is Saudi Arabia, but it's inverse, right? And Kenneth Waltz would argue this. Ultimately people have interests, and our interests lie in certain places. Because I'm me, I'm going to finish off with a discussion of the English school, because I think they have it just about right. So if you look at Martin White, so in the English school there are two approaches to understanding why nations form an international society, if it's just an international system. And I won't go into it here because there'll be another comp question, and I'm doing this for people who kind of know this, and I have an hour to write it. Martin White, there are two kinds of international society and two views, right? You have Hedley Bull saying, there's just a functional bit, that society is required to work with each other economically, and eventually that develops kind of closer relations, which will develop conventions for dealing with each other. Whereas Martin White thinks you need kind of an underlying culture, right? The development of an underlying culture. So the Enlightenment Republic of Letters, for example, is a good example. So I think that probably does a better job. Liberal democracy is actually a reflection of a certain cultural outlook that's grown in Europe and the West, and those countries tend not to fight each other. Actually, Wolf brings this up, we don't know, there isn't a strong empirical connection between democracy and peace because we don't have causal mechanisms, right? Is it maybe do democracies cause peace, or does peace cause democracy? Or is there some third factor? And I think that's probably Waltz's strongest criticism, and I'm mentioning as a tangent how embarrassing. It's easier when I write. We're back to Martin White. I think that's a good strong example. It kind of explains why democracies, regional democracies that share a certain bit of culture are able to cooperate more effectively than others. It shows, you could use this to explain why. Nope, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. I'm going to leave that there, because, it'd be easy to explain why everyone in the West gets along very well, like the Anglosphere, everyone speaks English. South American democracies operate very differently, and they're treated very differently by different parts of Europe and the West, or the global North, however you want to call it. Mostly because just they have different cultural ties. So I will leave it there. That's 17 minutes and 30 seconds, and I actually hit everything I want to talk about.